Hey guys, tonight we dive into a story that starts with betrayal. A career-ending moment, and ends with something far greater than you could imagine. Imagine working for almost 2 decades, building something from the ground up, being the one who holds everything together, and then, in a single breath, it all comes crashing down. This is Jake Wilson's story, a story of resilience, patience, and the ultimate mastery of control. You probably won't survive this one without a few jaw drops. So buckle up. Jake Wilson, 54 years old, had spent 17 years at Meridian Technologies in Columbus, Ohio. For nearly 2 decades, he had been the silent backbone of the IT department. From dial-up connections to the latest cloud systems, while 3 CEOs had come and gone, Jake was the one who always stayed. The company's entire infrastructure was built on his expertise, his knowledge, his late nights, and his commitment. But when his boss, Daniel, called him into his office that Monday morning, everything shifted. You see, loyalty, Jake's most valuable trait, had become his curse. The company had changed, shifted direction, and the people in charge no longer valued his contribution. Jake had always been the one to take pride in what he did, never asking for recognition. He had never pushed for promotions. His pride was in his work and the knowledge he provided. But in that moment, his quiet loyalty was dismissed, like yesterday's news. "We're eliminating your position," Daniel said flatly, as Jake's world seemed to stop for a second. Jake didn't react. No anger, no pleading, just a quiet acknowledgement. He nodded, packed his desk, and walked out the door without looking back. "It's fine," he told himself, as he gathered his things: his family photo, his son's mug from high school, and a cactus that had survived 17 years under fluorescent lights. These things, so simple, yet now were all he had left from a life that had just been appended. But the reality was, Jake had built more than a career. He'd built a legacy of value, and he knew that what he left behind wasn't just going to disappear. The news spread fast among his co-workers. They were younger, many of them had been trained by Jake, but they didn't truly understand the systems he had developed. These were systems that had taken years to perfect. They couldn't even navigate the custom software or dig through the layers of admin credentials that Jake had written himself. They didn't know what they'd lost. But Jake did. And as he walked out that door, there was no rage in him, just the cold realization that he'd been underestimated for far too long. He wasn't just a systems analyst, he was a creator, an architect, and now he was someone who would build something even more powerful, his own comeback. Jake Wilson had been the silent AR of everything worked. While the world outside advanced, Jay imagined the scene: a bustling tech company, people moving fast, technology evolving, but amidst all of this, one person remains unchanged, anchored. That was Jake. From the dial-up days to the era of cloud migration, he had watched technology grow, and he had grown with it. Each new software update, each network migration, each tiny security fix was his responsibility. He became the person everyone relied on when systems went down, and no one knew how to fix them. And yet, no one truly knew him. He had been the mentor to every new hire, the one who showed them the ropes, not just in terms of coding but in understanding the legacy. These young coders would come. His systems were old, but they were in his custom software, one touchable but now, as he sat alone in his office, packing up his things, Jake could see the difference in the eyes of the people around him. They knew what he'd done for them, but the recognition had never come. They just didn't understand that the systems they used every day were his creation. The new employees had no idea how much time Jake had spent securing, making sure that ever and yet, none of that mattered anymore. As Jake slowly packed his desk, he saw Bethany from marketing come over, her face filled with concern. Jake, I just heard," her voice trem. "It's fine," he said, his loyalty, his hours of work, the countless understand tea. He had worked through the weekends, never asking for a day off, never seeking a promotion. It had never been about that. It had been about the work, the systems, the infrastructure, and now all of that would fall on someone else. The younger employees, the ones who had replaced him, would have to deal with the fallout of leadership decisions. But Jake knew that he had done everything right. As he walked out the door for the last time, he didn't look back. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew that the company had underestimated him, and they would soon realize their mistake. Jake sat at home, in the quiet of his office, staring at his laptop. The silence of the morning was deafening. No alarms to wake him, no commute, just the weight of what had happened the previous day. He had been sent home, fired without warning. There was no closure, no explanation, just a flat decision. A single sentence that shattered everything he had known for nearly 2 decades. And yet, the hardest part wasn't the firing itself. It was the realization that he had been discarded by the very company he had poured his life into. There was no anger, no frustration, just a quiet, sinking feeling that this wasn't how it was supposed to end. After all the years, the late nights, the weekends spent at the office without a single complaint or request for praise, this was it. No thanks, no acknowledgement, nothing but the cold truth that his position was no longer needed. Andrea, his wife of 19 years, came in with a cup of coffee, placing it gently beside him without a word. She knew him better than anyone she knew when he needed space, and she knew that this wasn't just about a job. This was about something deeper. Loyalty, commitment, and trust had been his values for so long. He had stayed with the company because he believed in the mission, the growth, and in the relationships he had built. But now, all of that had been shattered. Jake didn't respond when Andrea asked if he needed anything. She knew the answer. She knew that the silence was just him processing what had happened. But, in his mind, the real question wasn't about the firing itself. It was about the people who had made the decision. Daniel, the young MBA with ideas about streamlining and digital transformation, and the consultant, Jason Phillips, brought in to take control. These were the people who had sidelined him, ignored him, and now, without warning, dismissed him like an outdated piece of technology. As he sat there, a flood of thoughts passed through Jake's mind. He thought about the company he had helped build, the late nights he had spent setting up secure systems to prevent breaches, to ensure that everything functioned properly. He thought about his mentorship of younger employees who, now, would be left to manage the systems without any idea of the complexities involved. No one else knew what he had done, how his knowledge had kept everything running behind the scenes. But there was more. Jake hadn't just been discarded by the company, he had been betrayed. As he went through his files, something caught his attention. While his termination had been abrupt, there was something far darker at play. In the hours following his firing, Jake began to uncover patterns that had once seemed small, insignificant. Now, they began to form a troubling picture. Financial irregularities, vendor transfers, payments to a company he didn't recognize. Apex Solutions Group. His curiosity piqued. Jake began to investigate further. It wasn't just the irregular transfers. Jake had noticed these over the past few months. But now, everything seemed to align. Apex Solutions Group, a company registered just last year, had been receiving inflated payments for software license renewals. At first, Jake didn't want to believe it. But the numbers didn't lie. A quick search revealed something even more alarming. Apex Solutions Group had a business address that led to a UPS store. That was odd. No real company would operate from a mailbox at a UPS store. Jake's mind raced. Who was behind this? His search led him down a darker path. Apex Solutions Group was owned by Thomas Wilcox, the CFO's brother-in-law. The dots connected themselves. This was no coincidence. The payments were inflated sometimes by 15%, sometimes by 20%. The sums were large enough to raise questions, but small enough to escape immediate scrutiny. Jake leaned back in his chair, realizing that he wasn't just dealing with a corrupt vendor. He was dealing with a corrupt system, one that had been actively siphoning funds from the company he had dedicated his life to. The people in charge, the same people who had just tossed him aside, were the very ones responsible for this fraud. The feeling that began to bubble inside Jake wasn't anger or rage, was something colder, something much more deliberate. Clarity. He had been wronged, but he now saw the bigger picture. What had started as a quiet betrayal at the hands of his former employers had turned into something far deeper, chance to do something much larger than himself. This wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about justice and accountability. Jake didn't react immediately. Instead, he took the time to plan, to strategize, and to methodically gather the evidence that would expose the fraud within the company. He knew that in order to get the truth out, it needed to be presented in a way that would be impossible to ignore. The key to this plan was precision. Nothing to direct. Nothing that could be dismissed as a disgruntled employee's complaint. No, Jake needed to build a case so solid that even the most powerful executives at Meridian Technologies would have no choice but to listen. The first step was clear. Secure the evidence. Jake had always been meticulous, a trait that had served him well in his role as a senior systems analyst. Years ago, when the company had undergone a legal audit, Jake had set up backup systems for tracking data and ensuring security. The legal team had signed off on it, and they'd never thought twice about it. Now, those backups were about to become his greatest asset. With the flash drive securely in hand, Jake began reviewing the data. He poured through internal emails, meeting minutes, and financial records that no one else had access to. The details that emerged were chilling. The payment history to Apex Solutions Group wasn't just fraudulent, it was deliberate, spanning nearly 18 months and involving key people within the company, including the CFO, Brian Wilcox, and others in the senior leadership team. Jake worked late into the night, cross-referencing the dates, pulling together spreadsheets, and tracking down business registrations. He uncovered more than just inflated payments. He discovered a series of consulting fees to a firm called Lakeside Business Solutions, another shell company. What was more alarming was that this company was owned by Patricia Wilcox, Brian's wife. This wasn't just a case of accounting oversight, it was systematic fraud. The deeper Jake dug, the more the pieces fit together. The fraud had been going on for years, and it was cleverly disguised. It wasn't a case of completely fake vendors. Real services were being provided, but the invoices were marked up significantly. The auditors, those tasked with protecting the company's finances, would never have suspected anything. It was the perfect crime, made even more dangerous by the trust everyone had in the system. As Jake sifted through the documents, a quiet thought emerged. This isn't just about getting my job back anymore. What he was uncovering went beyond the petty politics of corporate life. This was about integrity, about shining a light on the rot that had been allowed to fester. For years, his eyes narrowed as the realization hit. This wasn't just a betrayal of Hemet. was a betrayal of everyone who had worked at Meridian, everyone who had trusted the company's leadership. But Jake wasn't going to act impulsively. No, his next move needed to be strategic, deliberate, and perfectly timed. He needed leverage, but not in the form of anger. He needed precisioning. He had already begun building the case that would expose the fraud. As he sat back, reviewing the evidence, he formulated his plan. He would contact the board of directors, but not directly. Instead of sending an email from his own account, Jake would send it from a secure account he had set up years ago. It would look like an internal communication, official but not easily traceable. The email would outline the financial irregularities without being too direct, just enough detail to pique their interest and raise alarms. Timing was everything. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday. They would be discussing the quarterly financials, with bonuses to be approved. It was the perfect opportunity to hit them with the truth before they made any major decisions. If they didn't act on this information, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for them, but for the whole company. Wednesday morning arrived, and Jake sat in his car, parked across from Meridian Technologies headquarters. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Inside, the company was buzzing with activity. But Jake wasn't just another person heading into the office. He wasn't going to work. He was about to make his first move in a much bigger game. In the passenger seat of his car was his laptop, logged into a secure email account that he'd created for exactly this moment. This was no longer about making a living, it was about exposing a lie, one that had been built over the course of years, with the potential to bring down the entire company if the board didn't take action. The email Jake was about to send wasn't just a message, it was a well-crafted bombshell. He'd spent the last few days carefully drafting it, ensuring it was professional but pointed. The subject line read, "Financial irregularities, urgent review needed." Underneath it was a concise summary of the payments to Apex Solutions Group, a vendor with a suspicious business address linked directly to the CFO's family. Jake knew this would raise questions. The email was brief, but it was enough to plant the seed of doubt. He didn't mention the brother-in-law connection just yet. That would be a last resort. Instead, he focused on the facts, the growing payments, the lack of transparency, and the patterns that emerged as he cross-referenced the financials. The email ended with a call to action. "Please investigate immediately. I can provide further documentation if needed." Jake hit send at exactly 9:15 a.m. The timing was deliberate, perfectly synced with the board's meeting where they would be reviewing financials and discussing bonuses. If he had done this right, the message would reach them just as they were about to finalize their decisions. It was a moment of pure calculation. By 9:45 a.m., his phone rang. It was Daniel. Jake let the call go to voicemail. "Jake, we need to discuss your email immediately. Call me back." Jake didn't respond. He couldn't afford to be rushed. Instead, he drove to a local coffee shop, sat down, and waited. He opened his laptop again, making sure the evidence was backed up and secure. The waiting was always was, but Jake knew the stakes. This wasn't just about proving a point or getting a job back. This was about bringing truth to the surface. At 10:30, another email arrived. This one was from Vanessa, the HR representative. The tone of her message was different from Daniel's. It was colder, more formal. "Mr. Wilson, we've received concerning communication from you that may potentially violate your separation agreement. Please cease all contact with Meridian employees and remember your confidentiality obligations. Any further communications may result in legal action." Jake read the email calmly. This wasn't unexpected. It was their way of shutting him down. But he wasn't intimidated. The truth he was holding was too valuable to be silenced by threats. He hadn't signed a separation agreement, and they knew it. This was a game, and Jake wasn't about to play by their rules. By noon, Jake made another calculated move. He drove to his bank and accessed his safe deposit box. Inside was another, backup drive folder, but with critical information that he hadn't included in his regular system. These were original security protocols he had designed for the company years ago, including a detailed record of who had access to which systems. And when changes had been made, Jake's fingers moved swiftly as he scrolled through the documents. Brian Wilcox, the CFO, had personally requested expanded access to the financial approval systems exactly 18 months ago, when the Apex payments started. The pattern became clearer with each document he reviewed. This wasn't just about one corrupt employee. This was about a systemic issue at the highest levels of the company. Jake felt a twinge of satisfaction. Not because of revenge, but because, now, he had control. For the first time in a long while, the tables had turned. He wasn't the one being discarded anymore. He was the one who held the key to everything. Jake had spent years building systems for security, integrity, and order. But in the quiet moments after being fired, it became clear he had to do the same for himself. Everything he had worked for, the systems, the infrastructure, the knowledge had been leveraged against him. Now, it was his turn to leverage the information he had meticulously compiled over the years. The next step was simple, yet critical: connect the dots. Jake began poring over the data he'd collected, the vendor payments, the suspicious accounts, and the connections to the Wilcox family. He had all the evidence he needed. It was just a matter of putting it together in a way that would force their hand. It was late in the evening when he finally put it all together. The scheme was as clear as day now. Jake wasn't just looking at inflated invoices or a few bad decisions. He was staring at years of corruption, quietly masked behind the illusion of efficiency and corporate success. Brian Wilcox, the CFO, had worked with his brother-in-law to funnel company funds into Apex Solutions Group. The amounts were staggering, nearly $1.8 million over the past 18 months alone. But this wasn't the first time they had done something like this. Jake had uncovered a pattern, familiar one, of inflated invoices and creative accounting. This time, it wasn't just about the Apex payments. The same family connections were involved in another consulting firm, Lakeside Business Solutions, owned by Patricia Wilcox, Brian's wife. A second operation, the perfect cover-up. There was no way the auditors could have detected it. The consultants had provided services, yes, but the costs were marked up substantially. As far as the books were concerned, everything looked legitimate. But Jake knew better. He had the evidence, now emails, financial records, business registrations, and it was all too precise to ignore. Jake leaned back in his chair, calmly contemplating his next steps. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about trying to prove he was better than the people who had fired him. No, this was about bringing justice, exposing the corruption that had been festering inside the company for years. The company he had worked tirelessly for. He knew that if he acted hastily, they would dismiss him as a disgruntled former employee. If he went straight to the board, they might think he was just trying to tarnish the company's reputation. So, Jake decided to be strategic. He wasn't going to rush things, he would wait for the right moment, and that moment came the next day when he realized that the quarterly board meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday. They would be reviewing the financials, and the approval of bonuses would be on the table. This would be the perfect time to act, to strike with precision before they made their decisions. Jake began drafting his second email, one that would be far more impactful than the first. This time, he would make sure he had every piece of evidence at his disposal. He would be calm, logical, and direct, exactly the kind of person they couldn't ignore. Jake paused for a moment before sending the email, reflecting on how far he had come. From the moment he'd been let go, everything had changed. It was no longer about working for a paycheck. It was about proving that integrity, patience, and meticulousness could bring down even the most powerful systems. It was at that moment that Jake knew he had control. They had fired him, but they hadn't realized that they had just opened the door to their own destruction. Jake felt the weight of each passing hour, each minute, as the deadline for his email approached. His actions so far had been calculated, precise, and methodical. Yet, he couldn't deny the tension building within him. It wasn't the fear of failure. Jake had already moved past that. It was the waiting, the long stretch of time between sending his email and seeing the consequences unfold. The waiting, as any strategist knows, is the hardest part. Wednesday morning dawned clear and bright, the sun spilling through Jake's window as he stood at his desk, reviewing the final draft of the email one last time. He didn't need to change anything. It was perfect as it was. The subject was simple: financial irregularities, urgent review needed. The body contained all the details the board would need to start their investigation, just enough to pique their curiosity, but not so much that they could easily dismiss it. Jake felt his pulse quicken as he clicked the send button. It wasn't the same feeling as when he had worked on projects for Meridian. This wasn't about coding a system or solving a problem, was bigger. He was changing the game now. This was about exposing the truth. As soon as the email was sent, Jake's role in this corporate drama was no longer passive. He was an active player, one who had just thrown a rock into the pond, knowing that the ripples would eventually crash into the shores of the boardroom. At 9:15 a.m., Jake sat back in his chair, eyes fixed on the screen as he waited for any sign that his message had been received. By 9:45 a.m., the first response came: a missed call from Daniel. Jake didn't bother calling back. There was no need. He'd sent his message, and now it was time to see how they would react. Instead of feeling rushed or stressed, Jake felt an eerie calm wash over him. He had done what he needed to do. The rest was out of his hands. He didn't sit idly, though. While waiting for the board members to respond, Jake took another step to ensure the evidence was secure. He accessed his backup drive again, verifying that everything was backed up in multiple locations. He had already prepared for any scenario, from corporate retaliation to a legal battle. No matter what happened, Jake knew he would be able to protect himself. At exactly 10:30 a.m., another email appeared in Jake's inbox. This one was from Vanessa in HR. The tone was cold, calculated, and almost patronizing. "Mr. Wilson, we've received your email and would like to remind you that any communication regarding company matters post-termination may be a violation of your separation agreement. You are advised to cease all further contact with Meridian employees and refrain from engaging in any actions that might risk legal consequences." Jake read the email, his lips curling into a faint smile. They were trying to intimidate him, but it wasn't going to work. His separation agreement didn't exist, and they knew that this was simply their attempt to shut him down, to force him into silence. But Jake wasn't going to back down. If they thought they could silence him with threats, they were gravely mistaken. Instead of replying, Jake went to his safe deposit box for the second time in 2 days. There, he retrieved the original security protocols he had written for the company years ago. The documentation was damning. It wasn't just about Apex Solutions Group and the Wilcox family anymore. It was about everything. He knew exactly who had access to what systems and when. The truth about Brian Wilcox's requests for access to the financial approval systems in the months leading up to the Apex payments was the smoking gun. This wasn't just corporate mismanagement, this was deliberate fraud. Jake cross-referenced these records with the dates on which payments to Apex Solutions started, and the correlation was undeniable. This wasn't a mistake. This was a conspiracy. Jake knew what he had to do next. Contact someone who could help. That someone was Robert Chen, a board member who had always been a voice of reason and integrity within Meridian. They had worked together years ago on a security implementation project, and Jake trusted him more than anyone else in the company. If Jake could get the information to Robert, he knew the board would have no choice but to act. But the clock was ticking. He couldn't afford to waste any time. It wasn't easy for Jake to reach out to Robert. They hadn't spoken in years, not since the last security project they worked on together. But Jake knew Robert was one of the few people in the company who still had a sense of integrity. Rare trait among the upper management of Meridian Technologies. Robert was also one of the few board members who actually understood the systems that Jake had built. This wasn't just about business. It was about doing the right thing. Jake sat quietly in his office, laptop open, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He knew the information he was about to send would set the stage for what could be the most significant event in his life. He wasn't just getting back at his former employers. He was putting everything on the line. But, as he composed the email to Robert, Jake's resolve hardened. He wasn't doing this for revenge. He was doing it because the truth needed to come out. The email was simple and direct, just like Jake. Robert, I need 15 minutes of your time. There's something important you need to see. Jake hesitated before clicking send. He was about to shake the foundations of everything that had been built at Meridian Technologies. But the message was necessary. The board couldn't be allowed to sweep this under the rug. They needed to know what had really been going on for years. Within a few minutes, Robert replied. His message was straightforward. Jake, long time no speak. I'm available for a meeting. Let's talk. They agreed to meet at a park near the headquarters, a quiet, neutral space where they could talk without the prying eyes of their colleagues. As Jake drove to the meeting spot, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what he was about to do. He was no longer just a systems analyst, he was a whistleblower. An agent of change in a corporate system that had been corrupted from the inside out. When Jake arrived at the park, he saw Robert sitting on a bench, looking as calm as ever. Was almost as if Robert had expected this moment. The two men greeted each other, and Jake handed Robert a sealed envelope. Inside were the details of everything Jake had uncovered. The emails, the payment history, the evidence of collusion between the Wilcox family and the consultant, Jason Phillips. This is everything, Jake said, his voice steady but serious. The Apex payments, the Lakeside Business Solutions fraud, and the access logs. It's all here. I need the board to know. Robert took the envelope without hesitation, knowing that this was no ordinary meeting. The quiet calm of the park around them seemed to heighten the intensity of the moment. There was no turning back now. As Robert looked over the documents, Jake could see the shock in his face. It wasn't the kind of reaction Jake had expected. There was no outrage, no anger, just recognition. Robert knew exactly how deep this went. Jake, Robert said slowly, if this checks out, we're looking at criminal charges. There's no going back after this. Jake nodded. He had already known this. He had planned for it. The goal wasn't to take down individuals, it was to hold Meridian Technologies accountable for the mess it had become. The company had always prided itself on its innovations and forward-thinking approach. But behind the scenes, it had been rotten to the core. This wasn't just a scandal. This was corporate fraud on a grand scale. There's an emergency board session tomorrow, Robert continued, his voice tight with understanding. Finance committee review. This is going to be big, Jake. Jake could hear the tension in Robert's voice, and he knew that this wasn't something that would be easily swept under the rug. The consequences would be severe, but Jake was ready. He had already prepared himself for whatever came next. If he had to take down the whole company to expose the fraud, he would. But he wasn't in it for the glory. He was in it to make sure justice was served. The days leading up to the emergency board meeting felt like an eternity to Jake. He had already done the hard part, gathering the evidence, reaching out to Robert, and ensuring that everything was secure. Now, all he could do was wait. The night before the meeting, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what he had set in motion. It wasn't about the corporate drama anymore. It was about personal integrity, about doing what was right even when the odds were stacked against him. He had always been the reliable, quiet one in the background, the one who never caused waves. But now, the waters had been stirred, and there was no turning back. Jake knew that he was in a high-stakes situation. If the board members chose to ignore the evidence or find a way to bury it, they could easily discredit him. They could call him a disgruntled ex-employee, a man simply lashing out after being fired. He couldn't let that happen. His evidence had to be irrefutable, his intentions crystal clear. He needed to show them that he was doing this not for personal gain but for the good of the company and the good of the people who had unknowingly been affected by the fraud. As Jake lay there, he couldn't shake the thought that this was his final chance. He had worked for Meridian for nearly 2 decades. He had watched the company evolve from a modest office to a multinational corporation, surviving acquisitions and industry changes. But now, it was a company that had lost its way, one where the very leadership that had once trusted him had now turned on him. They had forgotten what it meant to be loyal to those who had built the company from the ground up. Jake's mind raced as he thought about his next steps. He had done everything by the book. He had been meticulous, patient, and thoughtful in the way he had approached this situation. There was no room for emotion. This wasn't about revenge. This was about exposing the truth, about forcing those in power to face the consequences of their actions. It was a few hours before dawn when Jake finally drifted into a restless sleep, his mind still churning with thoughts of what was to come. The next morning, the city of Columbus was quiet as Jake made his way to the Meridian headquarters. He had a job to do, a job that would not only affect his future, but also the future of a company he had given his life to. Walking into the building felt strange, almost surreal. Jake had walked these halls countless times, but today was different. He wasn't here to solve a technical issue or work on a new system. Today, he was here to bring down a corrupt system. That he made his way to the elevator. Jake was aware of the stares from his former colleagues. Some of them looked at him with sympathy, while others couldn't quite hide their curiosity. He had been the backbone of the company for nearly 2 decades. And now he was walking into the belly of the beast, not as an employee, but as a witness to its corruption. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent. The usual hum of activity, the rush of employees going about their day, seemed to have disappeared. Jake was focused, his thoughts clear and concise. There was no more time for second-guessing. He had already made up his mind he would expose the truth, no matter the cost. As the elevator doors opened to the boardroom, Jake stepped out and made his way inside. The board members were already seated, their faces a mixture of concern and uncertainty. They had received his email, and the situation had been set in motion. The board was no longer a group of faceless executives to Jake. They were the gatekeepers of justice in the corporate world, and it was his job to make sure they understood the depth of the problem they were facing. Jake, the interim CEO, greeted him with a stiff nod, her tone formal. "Thank you for coming. We've reviewed the information you sent. The situation you've uncovered is unprecedented." Jake stood still, his hands folded in front of him, not letting the weight of the moment overwhelm him. He had been in meetings like this before, but this time it was different. This time, he wasn't the one seeking approval. This time, they were the ones who needed him. Jake, Robert Chen spoke up, his voice calm and reassuring. "We've gone over everything. The forensic team is already looking into the Apex payments and the connection to the Wilcox family. This is bigger than any of us anticipated." Jake didn't speak immediately. He let Robert's words sink in. He could see the shock on the board members' faces, but he wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. He wasn't here to wallow in the details. He was here to make sure this company took responsibility for the mess it had created. Jake nodded slowly, a slight smile playing at the corner of his lips. He had expected this reaction, and it was exactly what he wanted. "I know this is hard to swallow," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "But you need to understand that what's been happening here isn't just a series of unfortunate mistakes. This is systemic corruption. This is fraud that goes all the way to the top." The room fell silent. Jake had said the words they all knew were true, but hadn't dared acknowledge. For a moment there was no movement, just the collective weight of the truth hanging in the air. "I didn't come here to destroy the company," Jake continued, his tone unwavering. "I came here because the truth can't stay buried. And if you want to make sure Meridian survives this, you need to fix it now." The silence in the room was deafening. Every board member in that polished, sleek boardroom had just been confronted with a reality they hadn't been prepared for. Jake wasn't just a whistleblower. He was the one who held the truth in his hands, and the truth was a powerful weapon. For the first time in years, the room felt smaller, the walls closing in on the executives who thought they were untouchable. Jake stood there, his posture solid and unwavering, as the room absorbed his words. He wasn't angry, he wasn't bitter, he was simply speaking the truth. The truth had a way of doing that, especially when it came to corruption at the highest levels. It made the powerful uncomfortable. It made them nervous. And most importantly, it made them question everything they thought they knew about their own success. The interim CEO, who had been visibly rattled, cleared her throat and leaned forward. Her fingers tapped on the table, a nervous habit Jake recognized. He had seen this type of response before in meetings, especially when the discussion was uncomfortable. "Jake," she started, voice trembling slightly, "we understand the seriousness of your claims, but we need time to investigate the full scope of these issues. It's not something we can rush." Jake nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering as he met her eyes. "Time is something you don't have. These actions have been going on for years. If you don't act now, it won't just be your jobs at risk, be the company's reputation, too." Robert Chen spoke next, his voice level but clearly concerned. "We need to bring in external auditors, forensic accountants. This could get messy. The scale of this operation is much larger than anyone here could have imagined." Jake appreciated Robert's sincerity. He had always been one of the few good men in the company, someone who truly understood the complexities of their systems. Still, Jake knew it wasn't enough. The company had ignored the signs for too long. People had been living in a fantasy world where everything was running smoothly. But now, with the truth out in the open, there was no more pretending. "You can bring in whoever you want," Jake said, his voice a little firmer, "but the truth is, already here, your job is to deal with the fallout and make things right." For a moment, the room was frozen. The board members were all processing, each lost in their own thoughts. Jake could see the hesitation in their eyes, the creeping fear that they were on the verge of a scandal that could obliterate everything they had worked for. Finally, the interim CEO spoke, her voice sounding more resolute now, though it still carried the weight of uncertainty. "We'll need to act quickly. The finance team will start an investigation immediately. But Jake, we need to understand what you want from this. What's your end goal here? What do you want?" Jake had anticipated this question. He wasn't looking for a settlement or some kind of backdoor deal. He didn't want money, and he certainly didn't want his job back. He had something far more important in mind. Accountability. "I want the truth to come out. I want real change. You need to fix this company, but more importantly, you need to make sure something like this never happens again," Jake said, his voice calm but carrying the force of someone who had lived through it all. The CEO seemed to digest the statement before responding. "We'll take this to the board, but we need your cooperation in the investigation. Your knowledge of the systems here is unparalleled." Jake was willing to cooperate, but only on his terms. He had seen enough corporate corruption in his years at Meridian to know that investigations could be manipulated or delayed. He needed assurances. "You can have all the cooperation you need," Jake said, "but I want full transparency. I won't be kept in the dark. And if I see anything being swept under the rug, I will act. I'm not backing down now." With that, Jake turned to leave the room. But just as he reached the door, the CEO stopped him with a simple question. "Jake, would you consider coming back to help us rebuild?" For a moment, Jake didn't say anything. He had been loyal to this company for 17 years, but that loyalty had been thrown away the moment they fired him without cause. Still, he knew they were in a bind now, and his decision would make a big impact. He thought about the offer for a brief second, then shook his head. "I'm not here for a job. I'm here to make sure the truth comes out. If you want to rebuild, that's on you. I've done my part." He walked out of the boardroom with his head held high, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. It wasn't the closure he had been hoping for, but it was progress. As Jake exited the building, his phone buzzed with a message from Stephen, the junior analyst who had texted him earlier in the week. "Jake, they're freaking out. There's talk of criminal charges. Everything's going to change. But I can't help but wonder. What now?" Jake paused as he looked at the message. There was still a long road ahead, and the final chapter hadn't been written yet. But one thing was certain: Meridian Technologies would never be the same again. Jake stepped into the crisp morning air, his mind still processing everything that had just transpired in the boardroom. The conversation had been intense, and though it wasn't over yet, he felt a strange sense of relief. He had taken the first step in what would undoubtedly be a long battle. But as he walked toward his car, Jake knew that the real work was just beginning. The board's response was inevitable. They would either act quickly and cleanly, or they would try to sweep the truth under the rug. He didn't trust them to do the right thing without a push, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to keep the pressure on. As he drove home, his phone buzzed with several messages. The first one was from Andrea, his wife. She had been supportive throughout this entire ordeal, but Jake knew she had to be feeling the weight of it all too. "How did it go, love?" Jake smiled as he read her text. He could imagine her sitting in their living room, sipping her coffee, waiting to hear the news. "It went as expected," Jake texted back. "The board knows everything now. It's up to them to act." Next, he saw a message from Stephen, the junior analyst. Stephen had been one of the few people who had stood by him during the darker days at Meridian. He had always admired Jake's knowledge and work ethic, and Jake had mentored him through the years. "Jake, the board is in chaos. They're scrambling to fix this. But what now? What's your next move?" Jake leaned back in his seat, taking a deep breath. The question was inevitable. What was his next move? He had taken down the major players, but there were still smaller cogs in the machine, and there was always the possibility of backlash. He needed to make sure that what he had started didn't get lost in the shuffle. This was bigger than just exposing fraud. It was about corporate accountability. The game had changed, and Jake was the one holding the cards. He quickly typed a reply. "For now, I'm staying out of it. I've done my part. Let's see how they handle this. Keep your head down and stay clear of the fallout." Stephen's response came quickly. "You're right, Jake. I'll watch and wait. But just know, this will have ripples far beyond what we see right now." Jake couldn't help but agree. The ripple effect of what he had done would extend far beyond the walls of Meridian Technologies. The press would catch wind of the story soon enough. There would be public investigations, and the legal consequences would be massive. But most importantly, the culture of corporate corruption he had exposed would make companies all over the world rethink their own practices. They would have to clean up their acts, or risk being the next target of someone like Jake. As he arrived home, Andrea greeted him with a warm hug. She could tell from the look on his face that there was relief, but also something more. Jake had always been a man of deep conviction, but this was a different kind of battle. He had chosen to fight not just for his own vindication, but for something far bigger. The next few weeks would tell the real story. A few days later, the media storm began. It didn't take long for the financial irregularities at Meridian Technologies to make the news. Local business sites were the first to report on it, but by mid-afternoon, the story had exploded into national headlines. The forensic team had confirmed that at least $4.5 million had been diverted over a 3-year period through inflated invoices and false vendor payments. And Jake Wilson, once a quiet, dependable systems analyst, was now a key figure in the investigation. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift. Brian Wilcox, the CFO, was placed on administrative leave, while the company's internal auditors and external investigators began to dig deeper into the fraudulent activities. Soon after, Jason Phillips, the consultant who had been hired to modernize the IT department, disappeared. The last reports Jake heard said Phillips had fled to Brazil, possibly to escape the legal repercussions that were beginning to catch up to him. As the investigation deepened, Meridian Technologies came under increasing pressure. Clients began pulling contracts, concerned about the company's ability to safeguard their data. Partners were re-evaluating their relationships, and investors began to lose confidence in the leadership. The stock price plummeted, and more executives found themselves being investigated for their involvement in the scandal. But the real drama was taking place behind closed doors. In the aftermath of the public outcry, the board of directors finally acknowledged the truth of Jake's findings. They had no choice. The evidence was undeniable. And as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that many of the company's top leaders were complicit in the cover-up. Some had directly benefited from the fraud. Others had ignored the warning signs in favor of maintaining their positions of power. Jake watched all of this unfold from a distance. He wasn't involved in the day-to-day operations anymore. He had done what he came to do. His role in the company was over, and now he had to decide what to do next. He could easily have returned to a new job. He had been offered high-ranking positions at other companies who were eager to snatch up someone with his expertise and integrity. But Jake wasn't interested in taking another job at the moment. For him, it wasn't about climbing the corporate ladder. It was about creating real change, not just for himself, but for the entire corporate world. Jake had become the unlikely hero, the quiet systems analyst who took down 3 corporate giants with nothing but a computer, a flash drive, and his unwavering commitment to doing what was right. It was a win not just for Jake, but for anyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or silenced in the workplace. The days following the explosive media coverage felt like a whirlwind for Jake. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from former colleagues, reporters, and even a few well-wishers. Everyone seemed to have their own opinion about what had happened, and Jake's name was everywhere. But despite the frenzy, Jake remained calm. He had taken the first step in exposing the corporate corruption, but the real battle had only just begun. It was time for him to watch the pieces fall into place, and he had no intention of letting them slide away unnoticed. As the weeks passed, the legal ramifications of the fraud became clearer. Brian Wilcox, the CFO, was officially charged with multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. His plea deal, which would allow him to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence, did little to improve his public image. Despite the reduction in his sentence, he would still face significant time in prison. The scandal had not only ruined his career but also irreparably damaged his reputation. His once prominent position in the company was now a cautionary tale to those who believed they could get away with corporate malfeasance. Meanwhile, Jason Phillips, the consultant who had been the architect of much of the fraudulent activity, nowhere to be found. Jake knew that Phillips was likely on the run, trying to avoid being caught by the authorities. Rumors swirled that he had fled to Brazil, where he hoped to escape extradition. But Jake wasn't concerned with Phillips anymore. He knew that justice would eventually catch up to him. The most surprising twist, however, was the involvement of Daniel, the young MBA with grand ideas about efficiency and streamlining operations. At first, Daniel had vehemently denied any involvement in the scandal, claiming he had been unaware of the fraudulent activities taking place under his nose. But as the investigation dug deeper, it became clear that Daniel had been complicit. He had known about the inflated payments to the Apex Solutions Group, and he had even played a role in facilitating the fake vendor contracts. Jake had suspected as much. When he noticed the subtle shifts in his access permissions at work, he had seen the way Daniel and the CFO had worked together to marginalize him and push him out of the company. The more Jake dug into the financial records, the clearer it became that Daniel was part of the scheme. He had been manipulating the system to line his own pockets and to keep his own position secure, while others were blindsided. As the investigation into Daniel's role progressed, it became evident that he would face serious legal consequences. The charges would likely be far less severe than those against Brian Wilcox, but they would still be enough to ruin his career. And that, Jake thought, was a fitting punishment. Daniel had thought he could get away with it. He had assumed that his position of power would shield him from scrutiny. But the truth had a way of catching up to people like him, and now there was no escape. Jake had done what he set out to do. He had exposed the fraud and made sure those responsible faced the consequences. But there was one more piece of business: to take care of the board of directors. The same board that had stood by while the company slid into corruption. The same board that had overlooked all the red flags. They, too, would need to answer for their role in allowing the fraud to go on for so long. The phone rang as Jake sat in his living room, sipping coffee and reflecting on the past few weeks. He wasn't sure what to expect. He hadn't heard much from the board since the meeting, but he had a feeling this call would be different. Jake's voice said, on the other end of the line. It was Robert Chen, the board member who had been his ally throughout this ordeal. "I knew it was coming," Jake replied, bracing himself. "What do they want?" "They want to offer you a position," Robert said, his voice laced with tension. "Not just any position, a chief security officer role. They want you back, Jake. Full executive privileges, direct reporting to the board. They're offering you everything you could ask for." Jake took a deep breath. The offer was tempting, but he wasn't sure he wanted to return to the same corporate machine that had tried to crush him. He had been with the company for nearly 2 decades, and they had discarded him without a second thought. The fact that they were now scrambling to offer him a position didn't sit well with him. They hadn't changed. They had simply realized they needed him to clean up the mess they had made. "I'm not interested," Jake said, his voice firm. "I've already done enough. Fixing Meridian Technologies isn't my responsibility. You all have to own this mess." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jake could almost feel Robert's disappointment. "You're sure?" Robert asked. "This position would give you full authority. It's your chance to make real change." Jake hesitated for a moment. The idea of fixing the company from the inside appealed to him, but it was not worth the cost. He had already given so much to Meridian, and the price had been too high. He had lost his job, his reputation had been tarnished, and the company had discarded him when he was no longer useful. Now, they were asking for his help, but it felt like too little, too late. "I'm sure," Jake said. "I've done my part. Now, it's time for the company to fix itself. I won't be your savior. I'm stepping away." Robert didn't argue. He had known Jake long enough to understand his decision. They both knew that sometimes stepping away from a problem was the only way to truly fix it. As Jake walked away from the call, he felt a sense of satisfaction. He had exposed the corruption. He had made sure the people responsible were held accountable. And now, he was free to move on. Meridian Technologies would either learn from this scandal, or it would crumble under the weight of its own mistakes. But Jake wasn't concerned with that anymore. He had done what he could, and now, he was ready to leave the past behind. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake knew that whatever came next, he had made the right decision. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. Jake sat at his kitchen table, the evening sun casting a warm, golden hue through the window. He had a quiet sense of accomplishment, but there was also a realization settling in. The events of the past month had transformed him. What had started as a simple betrayal had turned into a battle that, in the end, not only exposed corruption, but also made him reevaluate his own life. Jake had spent 17 years at Meridian Technologies, and he'd done it with loyalty. It had been the foundation of his work ethic, yet, as the dust settled and he saw the company scrambling to patch up its broken structure, he couldn't ignore the truth. Loyalty in business could only go so far. It wasn't just a story of corporate greed. It was about a man, once so deeply embedded within a system, discovering his true worth. Jake had been that dependable guy, the one who fixed the systems, the one who never said no. But what did loyalty get him in the end? A firing. The cold reality of it hit him hard at first. But now, as he sat reflecting, he understood. It wasn't just about doing good work. It was about doing work that mattered, being valued, and having control over your own fate. In those quiet moments, Jake thought about his personal life, too. He had been so focused on his job that he had often overlooked other aspects of himself, like his relationship with Andrea, or the time he could have spent traveling with his daughter, Olivia, who had just finished grad school. Andrea, his anchor, had stood by him through everything. And it was only now, looking back, that Jake realized how much he had taken her for granted. There was a deep regret there, but also a profound sense of gratitude. She had always supported him, even when he was working late nights and weekends, building the company's infrastructure. Yet, now, it was clear to Jake that he had been running on autopilot, never stopping to enjoy life outside of work. The past few weeks had been a moment of clarity, a reminder that life wasn't just about climbing the corporate ladder or proving your worth to others. It was about finding your own path and having the courage to take it, regardless of the consequences. Meridian Technologies had offered him a chance to come back and lead, but it wasn't the right path for him anymore. He had already done more than enough. It was time to focus on something else, the next chapter of his life. That night, as Jake sat on the porch with Andrea, they talked for hours. It wasn't about work, or the scandal that had engulfed Meridian, but about what came next. They talked about traveling, about spending more time with Olivia, about Jake finally letting go of the past and embracing new opportunities. Andrea had been the one to remind him of this when things seemed darkest. She had always been his rock. But tonight, Jake realized just how much he had neglected her and their family during all those years at the company. "I think it's time for something new," Jake said, watching the stars twinkle overhead. "I don't know exactly what it will look like yet, but I'm ready." Andrea smiled at him, her hand resting on his. "It's funny, isn't it? We spend so much time chasing what we think we need, only to find out that what we really need is sitting right in front of us." Jake looked at her and nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him. He knew she was right. All these years, he had been focused on climbing, proving, and protecting his career. But now, he understood that true success wasn't defined by promotions or power. It was about balance, purpose, and living a life that felt whole. The next few weeks were a blur of changes. Jake decided to take some time off and travel, something he hadn't done in years. He went to places he had always wanted to visit, quiet, scenic spots where the hustle of everyday life seemed far away. With Andrea by his side and Olivia joining them when she could, Jake felt a sense of freedom he had long forgotten. In the midst of these peaceful moments, Jake started to think about his future. The world was full of possibilities, and he wasn't sure what he wanted to do next. One thing was clear. He no longer needed to be a part of a broken system. He had spent years fixing things for others, but now, it was time for him to fix his own life, and that meant moving away from corporate giants like Meridian, and perhaps venturing into something entirely new. Jake began researching other career opportunities, places where he could use his skills and experience in a meaningful way, without the corporate politics that had left him feeling unappreciated. He also began to consider the value of teaching and mentoring, helping others avoid the same mistakes he had made. His work with Stephen, the junior analyst, had sparked an interest in guiding the next generation. Maybe it was time for Jake to become a mentor in his own right, helping others. navigate their careers without the toxic culture he had witnessed at Meridian. And then there was the thought of giving back. He had always worked with corporate structures, but now Jake felt a pull toward social impact. What if he could combine his experience in IT systems with a cause that was more aligned with his personal values? Perhaps non-profit work, or working with small businesses in need of the kind of leadership he could provide. As the days turned into weeks, Jake felt himself transforming in ways he hadn't anticipated. The pressure of being defined by his job, by his role at Meridian, was lifting, and he was beginning to understand who he was outside of that identity. The work he had done to expose corruption was important, but it was only a small part of the larger journey he had yet to complete. And so, Jake found himself looking to the future with hope. The past had been messy, but it had led him to a place of clarity. As the final pieces of the Meridian saga played out in the courts, he began to look forward to the things that truly mattered: his family, his passions, and his legacy. He didn't need to be the hero of a corporation anymore. He could be the hero of his own story. The morning light broke gently over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the rolling hills as Jake sat at his favorite cafe in a quiet corner of the city. The months since the scandal at Meridian had changed his life in more ways than one. Jake had watched the company, the place that had once consumed so much of his time and energy, unravel as the truth came to light. The executives had faced legal consequences, the board had shifted, and the company was now on its way to rebuilding. Though Jake wasn't sure if that rebuilding would ever fully erase the scars left behind. He had received his fair share of praise from colleagues, from former co-workers, and even from the media. But Jake wasn't focused on the praise. His journey had never been about recognition. It had been about facing truth and doing what was right, regardless of the consequences. That's why he had walked away from the tempting offer to rejoin the company, even though it came with full executive privileges. He had done what he set out to do, and it was time to move on. And yet, despite the turmoil and the difficult lessons learned, Jake now felt a quiet satisfaction. He wasn't the same person who had walked into the Meridian building all those years ago, eager to prove his worth. He had been pushed out, betrayed, and tested in ways he never thought possible. But, in the end, it was this very experience that gave him the clarity and courage to embrace a new chapter. Sitting there, watching the world wake up around him, Jake realized how far he had come, not just professionally, but personally. The past few months had been a journey of self-discovery. No longer chained to a corporate structure that didn't value him, he was free to explore his own path. Jake had made the decision to step outside the world he knew. It was time to take the leap into something new, something more fulfilling, something that would give him a sense of purpose beyond just making a paycheck. As he sipped his coffee, a thought occurred to him. Perhaps the lessons he had learned could be of value to others. After all, Jake had always been the one people turned to for advice. His ability to see patterns, his knack for understanding systems, and his deep loyalty had always made him a valuable asset. But now, he saw these qualities in a new light. What if he could help people avoid the same traps he had fallen into? What if he could teach them how to navigate corporate environments, how to understand the true power of trust, and how to avoid becoming a pawn in someone else's game? Jake had already started to dabble in mentoring, offering advice to a few people in his network who were facing similar challenges. But now, he was beginning to see the bigger picture. The knowledge he had accumulated over his career could be applied in ways that were far more meaningful than working within a company that didn't appreciate him. Perhaps he could create a platform where he could share his experiences, a place where he could mentor others who wanted to avoid corporate pitfalls and truly build careers that were fulfilling, ethical, and purpose-driven. He smiled as he thought about the possibilities. There was a world of opportunity out there, and it wasn't confined to boardrooms or office walls. Jake knew that he could use his skills and experiences to help others, to guide them toward creating the kind of work-life balance that had eluded him for so long. It was time for him to take a different approach, to shift his focus from fixing broken systems to empowering people to avoid becoming part of those systems in the first place. The mentorship he was considering could go beyond simply sharing technical knowledge, could be about teaching others how to make ethical decisions in their careers, how to navigate power dynamics, and how to maintain their integrity in the face of adversity. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of his phone. It was Andrea, his steady support throughout all of this. "How's the coffee?" She texted, a simple question, but one that always made him smile. "Perfect," Jake replied, taking a moment to reflect on how simple moments like these had become so much more meaningful in the wake of everything that had happened. "Ready for lunch later?" Andrea asked. Jake glanced at his watch and nodded to himself. It had been a busy few weeks, but now he had more control over his time. No more corporate meetings or last-minute deadlines. No more stress from executives who saw him only as a resource to be exploited. He was ready to focus on the important things: family, relationships, and creating a new career that would allow him to live his life with authenticity. "Yes, I'm ready," he texted back, feeling a sense of gratitude for the life he had, and for the lessons he had learned. As he got up to leave the cafe, Jake thought about his new mission: to help others navigate the complexities of modern work culture while maintaining their own integrity. He was no longer looking for a promising title or a high-paying job. What mattered now was building something real, something that could make a lasting impact. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Jake felt more certain of his path than ever before. He had been tested in ways he could never have predicted, but now he was stronger, more self-aware, and more empowered than he had been in years. There was a world of opportunity out there, one where he could share his experiences and help others avoid the pitfalls he had encountered along the way. He didn't need to return to Meridian or any other company. He didn't need to chase after the same old goals. What mattered now was creating something that would be meaningful, not just to him, but to others. And in doing so, Jake was finally free to live his life on his own terms. The months following Jake's decision to turn down the board's offer were both reflective and exciting. The world outside of Meridian Technologies had a different rhythm, a quieter one, but Jake had never felt more alive. He began the process of building his new career as a mentor, creating a platform where he could guide others. Jake's focus wasn't just about navigating corporate systems. It was about offering people the tools to build ethically sound, high-value careers that aligned with their personal values. Jake started a small online coaching business, combining his years of experience in IT with his newly found passion for leadership, integrity, and resilience. His goal was simple: to help individuals avoid the mistakes he had made, to build sustainable careers, and to break free from toxic corporate cultures. His clients, initially a few friends and colleagues from the past, soon grew to include young professionals and ambitious entrepreneurs who wanted to learn how to approach their careers mindfully. Through his workshops, seminars, and one-on-one coaching, Jake's message was clear. In a world that often values power, speed, and profit over people, true success is about balance, authenticity, and self-respect. Jake's teachings weren't about simply getting ahead at all costs. Instead, they focused on building foundations of trust, loyalty, and self-mastery. What amazed Jake most was the feedback he received from his clients. Many of them had been in the same position he had once been in, stuck in corporate roles that drained them, working long hours without recognition and feeling like they were just cogs in a machine. Now, they were learning to create careers that were purpose-driven and aligned with their own passions. "Jake, I can't thank you enough," one client messaged him after a particularly tough coaching session. "I was so ready to quit my job, but after hearing your advice, I now see the path forward. I've started advocating for my worth, and my boss is taking me seriously for the first time." Jake sat back, reading the message and realizing that what he had created, this new path, was meaningful. It wasn't about the money or the accolades. It was about helping others feel empowered in their careers and their lives. He had always believed in the power of personal responsibility, and now he was passing that on to others who needed it most. But while Jake was building this new legacy, there was still the question of his old legacy, the one tied to Meridian. The truth was, Jake was still not entirely free of the past. There had been lingering doubts in his mind, moments where he questioned whether he should have returned to the company. It was a difficult realization. Even though he had walked away from the corporate world, that world still had a hold on him. There were conversations with old colleagues, small messages on LinkedIn from executives offering advice and asking about the situation. Some days, it felt like his old identity as a corporate savior still clung to him, but Jake knew that he had outgrown it. His decisions were no longer based on survival or climbing the ladder. He was building something far more personal, authentic, and lasting. One evening, as he sat with Andrea on their back porch, sipping wine, she asked him, "Do you ever think about going back to the corporate world?" Jake thought for a moment, his gaze distant as he watched the last of the evening's light fade. He had been asked this question a few times already. Sometimes, it came from old friends, from former colleagues who still didn't quite understand why he had walked away. The idea of going back to corporate life, even with the power and privileges that came with the offer from the board, was tempting, but only for a second. Jake realized that the man he was now could never go back to that life. "I've thought about it," he replied, turning to face Andrea, "but I think I've already built my legacy. And it's not the one I thought it would be. It's not about the big office or the high salary. It's about the lives I'm changing now, the people I'm helping. That's worth more than any promotion." Andrea smiled, her hand resting gently on his. "You're already a legend in your own right." Jake chuckled. "Maybe. But what matters now is helping others find their path, and learning to enjoy life along the way." That summer, Jake took a long trip with Andrea and Olivia, a journey that would take them through the places Jake had always wanted to visit but had never had time for. They walked through cobbled streets in Europe, explored the mountains in South America, and spent lazy afternoons near the ocean, reflecting on the life Jake had built and the one he was now creating. For the first time in years, Jake felt free. And as Jake sat in a small cafe in a quiet corner of a village, looking out over the vast blue ocean, he realized that he had finally found balance. He had discovered that real success wasn't just about climbing the corporate ladder or earning recognition. It was about creating something meaningful, helping others, and living with integrity. He had walked away from a world that had tried to define him, and created his own path, one built on purpose and authenticity. Jake had learned that the greatest victories weren't the ones that came from winning at any cost, but the ones that came from staying true to who you are and doing what's right, even when it's hard. True success was about living life with intention, about finding fulfillment beyond external rewards. And most importantly, about leaving a legacy that mattered not to the world, but to those whose lives you touched.